2338. February 10, 1722. Off the coast of Cape Lopez, modern-day Gabon. The dawn mist hangs low over the Atlantic. A British warship called the HMS Swallow is sliding silently toward a pirate vessel anchored in the bay. On the deck of that pirate ship, a tall man in a crimson damask waistcoat stands alone. A diamond cross hangs from a gold chain around his neck. 2 pistols are slung across his shoulders on a silk sling. He is the only sober man aboard. His name is Bartholomew Roberts, and in the next 20 minutes, a single blast of grapeshot will tear open his throat and end the golden age of piracy forever. He didn't start his journey with a black flag and a cutlass. He started it as a kidnapped Welsh navigator counting wage coins on a slave ship, an honest sailor dragged screaming into a life he never asked for. If you are looking for the Black Bart true story, this is the brutal reality. The most successful pirate in recorded history began as a victim of piracy. Over 3 years, he would capture more than 400 ships. He would terrify 2 continents. He would draft the first written workplace constitution in the English-speaking world, and the British Empire would spend a fortune trying to erase him from the seas. Before we sail any further into this hidden corner of maritime history, please like and subscribe for more forgotten true stories. I have a list of rare details coming up that almost no documentary covers, and I would love to know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Now, let's go back to a quieter June afternoon 3 years before that final battle. In June of 1719, a Welsh sailor named John Roberts was working as the 3rd mate on a slave ship called the Princess of London. He had recently changed his first name to Bartholomew, possibly to avoid creditors, possibly to start fresh. He was 37 years old, which was practically elderly for a man at sea in that era. He was unmarried. He was a skilled navigator. He had spent 2 decades hauling cargo, charting coastlines, and earning honest wages along the West African coast. He was, by every measurable standard, the most boring man on his ship. Then a pirate sloop appeared on the horizon flying a black flag. The pirate captain was a charismatic Welshman named Howell Davis. Davis boarded the Princess of London, looted her cargo, and demanded her crew. Roberts refused. He fought. He cursed. He had no interest whatsoever in becoming an outlaw. Davis didn't care. He needed an experienced navigator, and Roberts was the best he had ever seen. Davis pressed him into service at gunpoint and sailed away with Roberts as an unwilling prisoner. For 6 weeks, Bartholomew Roberts hated every second of his new life. He grumbled about it openly. He told the crew he had been kidnapped and considered them all criminals. The crew, in turn, began to respect his honesty. He was educated. He was sober. He could read the stars and calculate latitude by dead reckoning when other men got lost. Then, on the coast of the island of Principe, everything changed. The Portuguese garrison stationed there lured Howell Davis into an ambush at a colonial banquet. He was shot dead in the harbor. The pirate crew rowed back to their ship in a panic, leaderless, furious, and dangerous. According to the eyewitness account later given to the trial commission, they gathered on the deck to elect a new captain. To the absolute shock of every man present, they nominated Bartholomew Roberts. He had been with them for less than 2 months. He despised piracy. He was a kidnap victim. He should have refused. Instead, according to the chronicler Captain Charles Johnson, Roberts stood up and delivered one of the most cynical and brilliant acceptance speeches in maritime history. He said that since he had already dipped his hands in muddy water and must be a pirate, it was better to be a commander than a common man. Better, he said, to be a giant in their world than a worm in any other. The reluctant navigator chose the black flag, and the most disciplined criminal enterprise of the 18th century had just found its CEO. Hollywood has done immense damage to our understanding of Golden Age piracy. If your mental image of a pirate captain comes from a certain Disney franchise, you probably picture a rum-soaked madman shouting nonsense, with bottles rolling at his feet and parrots squawking on his shoulder. That image fits about 90% of historical pirates reasonably well. It fits Bartholomew Roberts almost not at all. Roberts was a teetotaler. He drank only tea. He banned heavy drinking after sundown on his own ships. He insisted that lights be extinguished at 8 in the evening, and that any crewman wishing to continue drinking must do so on the open deck in the cold air, where the watch could see him. He held religious services on Sundays. He wore tailored coats of crimson damask and waistcoats of the finest fabric his prizes could provide. He carried himself like a gentleman officer of the Royal Navy, who had simply chosen the wrong side of the law. This is one of the great hidden truths of maritime history. Black Bart was less a wild buccaneer and more a calculating executive. Try this thought experiment. Imagine a kidnapped corporate accountant being marched into a failing startup at gunpoint, then realizing within 6 weeks that he could run the company better than the founders. That is almost exactly what happened on the deck off Principe. Roberts brought structure to chaos. His first act as captain was to demand that the crew put their agreement in writing. This was unheard of. Most pirate crews operated on verbal traditions and shouted votes. Roberts insisted on a contract. I always find it fascinating how popular history reduces complex men like Roberts to cartoon villains. The court records from his eventual trial, preserved in the British National Archives, paint a very different portrait. They describe a captain who fined his men for swearing on the Sabbath, a man who refused to attack ships flying the Welsh ensign out of patriotic loyalty, a leader who treated captured prisoners with chilling politeness, returning their personal letters and inquiring after their families before deciding whether to kill them. He was running a maritime startup with the discipline of a Swiss bank. The reluctant accountant had become the dread navigator of 2 oceans. But the moment he picked up the captain's hat, every empire on earth marked him as a man to be hunted. Modern pirate movies love to show crews as one big happy family of brigands. The historical reality of life aboard a pirate ship was a constant low-grade civil war. Men of different nations, different religions, different reading levels, and wildly different temperaments were stuffed into a wooden box at sea for months on end. Tensions were constant. Mutinies were frequent. And no 2 men ever embodied this fault line more perfectly than Bartholomew Roberts and his first quartermaster, Walter Kennedy. Kennedy was Irish, illiterate, and a former London footpad. He had been a street robber before joining a pirate crew, and he carried the values of the alleyway with him onto the open sea. Where Roberts believed in discipline, written rules, and the long game, Kennedy believed in grabbing what you could and spending it before sundown. Where Roberts dressed like a gentleman, Kennedy looked like a brawler. Where Roberts wanted to build a fleet, Kennedy wanted to retire to a tavern. They were the 2 halves of every criminal partnership in history, the strategist and the smash artist. For several months in 1719, the partnership actually worked. Roberts captured a Dutch trading vessel near Brazil. Then he pulled off one of the most audacious heists in pirate history. In the Bay of Bahia, he sailed his small sloop directly into a fleet of 42 Portuguese merchant ships preparing to cross the Atlantic with a treasure shipment for the King of Portugal. He picked out the richest-looking vessel, calmly came alongside her, and took her in a matter of minutes. The prize contained roughly 40,000 gold moidores and a jeweled cross intended as a personal gift for the Portuguese monarch. Roberts hung that cross around his own neck. He would still be wearing it on the morning of his death 3 years later. The Bahia raid made Roberts famous overnight. It also gave Walter Kennedy ideas. Roberts sailed his prize south, intending to use it as the foundation of a long pirate career. He sent Kennedy ahead in their original small sloop to scout the coast. Kennedy looked at the gold in his hold, looked at the open sea, and made a different decision. He turned the sloop around and sailed away with the original ship, the original crew loyal to him, and a substantial portion of the loot. Bartholomew Roberts was abandoned in the South Atlantic. I want you to feel the weight of that betrayal. 3 months as captain, one spectacular victory, a jeweled cross around his neck that could have funded his retirement, and then his own second-in-command vanished over the horizon with half his men, half his fortune, and the ship he had captured them on. Kennedy went on to drink himself into stupidity in the taverns of Ireland, get arrested for an unrelated robbery, and hang at execution dock in London the following year. He chose to live small and die quickly. Roberts chose something else. He chose to write a constitution. Stranded with a depleted crew on a single Portuguese prize, humiliated by a man he had trusted, surrounded by an Atlantic Ocean that wanted him dead, Bartholomew Roberts did something no pirate had ever formally done before. He gathered his remaining men on the deck and proposed that they put their rules in writing. The document he drafted has come down to history as the Pirate Articles of Bartholomew Roberts. It contained 11 clauses. It was a workplace constitution centuries ahead of its time. Article 1 gave every man an equal vote in affairs of the moment and an equal share of fresh provisions and strong liquor seized. Article 2 governed the distribution of plunder according to rank, with the captain receiving 1.5 shares and the ordinary sailor receiving 1. Article 3 banned gambling for money at cards or dice. Article 4 enforced lights and candles out at 8 at night. Article 5 required every man to keep his weapons clean and ready. Article 6 forbade women or boys from being brought aboard. Article 7 sentenced any man who deserted ship in battle to death or marooning. Article 8 settled all personal quarrels by formal duel ashore, with pistols and cutlasses, never on board the ship. Article 9 set a retirement fund, with every man receiving 1,000 pieces of 8 from the common stock when he chose to leave. Article 10 created an insurance scheme, with detailed compensation for lost limbs. $800 for a right arm, $600 for a left, $600 for a right leg, $500 for a left, $100 for an eye or a finger. Article 11 preserved Sunday as a day of rest. Pause on that for a moment. In 1719, when British Royal Navy sailors were being flogged for minor infractions, and merchant crews were paid pennies for backbreaking work, a Welsh outlaw on a stolen Portuguese ship had drafted the first written disability insurance policy in the English-speaking maritime world. The Royal Navy did not appreciate the innovation. News of Roberts's growing fleet reached the Admiralty in London within months. Reports came in from sugar merchants in Barbados, from slave traders in the Bight of Benin, from Portuguese governors in Brazil. A coordinated response began. The Admiralty offered increased bounties. Colonial governors raised militia. Sloops of war were dispatched. Pirate hunters were licensed. Worst of all for Roberts, the captured members of his crew began appearing on gibbets at every major port in the Atlantic. 20 bodies hanging in Kingston Harbor, 8 more in Bridgetown, a dozen left to rot in chains at the entrance to Cape Coast Castle. Their bodies were tarred to slow decomposition, and the iron cages they hung in were custom forged to keep the bones intact for years. Try to grasp what those displays were designed to do. It is the maritime equivalent of executive billboards. A king's empire telling every sailor in every port that the cost of joining Bart Roberts was your body left swinging in the harbor wind for 2 summers and a winter. Roberts was utterly powerless to save them. The reluctant accountant had become a hunted man with a price on his head, and an entire navy turning its attention his way. The winter of 1719 found Bartholomew Roberts running south along the West African coast, with the Royal Navy closing in behind him. He needed a place where European warships could not easily follow. He found one of the worst stretches of coastline in the known world. The coast of West Africa in that era was a graveyard for white sailors. Malaria, yellow fever, dengue, and a dozen other diseases killed European crews at staggering rates. The British called it the white man's grave. Naval ships avoided it when they could. Slave forts lined the coast at intervals, and between those forts were endless miles of mangrove, fever swamp, and uncharted shoreline where a small fast ship could vanish for weeks. Popular folklore likes to imagine pirates lounging on tropical beaches drinking out of coconuts. The reality of Roberts's African months was less romantic and considerably more agonizing. There was no Skull Island. There was no buried treasure map. There was dysentery, recurring fever, brackish water, biscuits so wormy that men were forbidden from eating below deck, because the sight of their food in daylight made them sick. There was the constant grinding terror of betrayal from his own crew, because every man aboard knew that turning Bartholomew Roberts into a colonial governor would buy a king's pardon and a small fortune. We have to consider the psychological state of a man in that position. Roberts was sober every single day. He could not numb himself with rum. He carried the memory of Kennedy's betrayal. He carried the knowledge of his hanged men. He carried the gold cross of the Portuguese king around his neck while sleeping on a deck warped by tropical heat, with rats running over his boots. Historians have long debated why he did not simply quit. The British were quietly offering pardons to pirate captains who surrendered with their crews in this period. Several other famous pirates accepted those deals. Roberts could have walked away. He had enough wealth hidden in various ports to live as a country gentleman in Wales for the rest of his life. He chose to stay at sea. This reveals something terrifying about the man. He had become addicted not to the violence and not to the wealth but to the command itself, to being the most dangerous decision-maker in any given stretch of ocean. He spent those fever-soaked months studying the slave trade schedules along the coast, mapping the seasonal patterns of the trade winds, and learning which European flags meant prey and which meant fight. The reluctant navigator who had refused to join Howell Davis 2 years earlier was gone. He had been replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. A new kind of pirate was about to surface in the Atlantic. Spring of 1720 brought a radically transformed Bartholomew Roberts back into the shipping lanes. The careful gentleman captain who had drafted articles and negotiated politely with prisoners was still there, but a strategist had taken control behind his eyes. He realized that the traditional pirate model was broken. Most pirate captains operated alone in a single ship, raided whatever crossed their path, then ran for a known hideout. The Royal Navy had mapped those hideouts. Colonial governors had paid informants in every tavern from Boston to Bridgetown. A solitary pirate ship was a target waiting to be cornered. Roberts introduced a doctrine that horrified traditional sea thieves. He decided to operate as a fleet, never as a single vessel, and to give every ship in that fleet the same name. He renamed his flagship the Royal Fortune. When he captured a better ship, he transferred his crew and his guns onto the new prize and renamed her the Royal Fortune as well. The old ship was either burned, scuttled, or rebranded as a smaller consort. At any given moment during 1720 and 1721, there were as many as 3 separate vessels in the Atlantic flying that name under his overall command. Imagine a modern corporate raider operating under a constantly shifting set of shell companies, all named the same thing, registered nowhere, surfacing in different harbors on the same day. That is the kind of confusion Roberts wove around the navies hunting him. Colonial reports from this period are full of contradictions. The Royal Fortune was reported off Newfoundland and off Senegal in the same week. She was described as a 32-gun frigate by one witness and a small brigantine by another. Both witnesses were telling the truth. He commissioned personal flags that took psychological warfare to new extremes. His most famous standard showed him standing on 2 skulls, one labeled with the letters ABH and the other AMH. The initials stood for a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head. The governors of those 2 islands had personally led expeditions against him in earlier years. He was telling them, in flags visible across miles of open water, that he intended to take their heads in revenge. His enforcer through this period was a much more reliable man than Walter Kennedy. Henry Glasby was a captured master mariner who had been pressed into service much as Roberts himself had been. Glasby tried to escape 3 times. Roberts caught him each time. On the 3rd occasion, the crew voted to execute him, and Roberts, in one of the most surprising acts of his career, personally intervened and shamed the crew into sparing him. Glasby would later testify at the trial that Roberts had saved his life. He would also testify, accurately and devastatingly, against every other man on the ship. Roberts had built a fleet that could appear anywhere, and a personal brand of terror that arrived before his sails did. The Newfoundland fishing port of Trepassey learned this in June of 1720, when he sailed into the harbor at the head of his crew with drums beating and trumpets playing, and the entire population of 1,200 fishermen and the crews of 22 anchored ships fled into the woods rather than fight him. He burned every ship in the harbor except one, which he kept for himself. A captured merchant captain later told the Boston News-Letter that watching Roberts sail into a harbor was like watching a black storm front move across the water. You knew exactly what was coming, and there was nothing in the world you could do to stop it. Now we have to talk about money, because no pirate empire ran on glory alone. By 1721, Bartholomew Roberts was operating the most expensive criminal enterprise in the Atlantic. His fleet at peak strength carried somewhere between 300 and 400 men. Every one of those men expected a share. Every cannon needed powder. Every sail needed canvas. Every hull needed careening, which meant beaching the ship, stripping her of barnacles, and recoating her bottom with tar, a process that took weeks and required massive supplies of pitch, tallow, and timber. Pirate hunters loved to talk about treasure. Real pirate captains spent more time worrying about gunpowder shipments than gold doubloons. Roberts solved the resource problem the way a corporate executive solves a supply chain crisis. He built a 2-ocean conveyor belt. The pattern went like this. In the African months, roughly November through April, he hunted along the Guinea coast, the Bight of Benin, and the islands off modern Sierra Leone and Liberia. The targets were Dutch, French, English, and Portuguese slavers carrying captured Africans across the Atlantic. Slavers were ideal prizes. They carried gold, gunpowder, trade goods, and stockpiles of food. Roberts would seize the ships, take the cargo, and decide what to do with the human beings chained in the holds. This is the most morally complex chapter of his career, and the one most piratromance content carefully avoids. Some captured Africans were forced to work the pirate ships. Others were sold by Roberts's crew to slave traders at other ports. A small number joined the pirates as free men and fought alongside them. The historical record is brutal and inconsistent, because Roberts and his crew were not freedom fighters. They were criminals who exploited every body and every cargo within reach. After the African raids, Roberts crossed the Atlantic on the trade winds, arriving in the Caribbean in May or June. There he hunted the sugar fleets sailing from Jamaica, Barbados, and Martinique back to Europe. Sugar in this era was as valuable as petroleum is today. A single captured sugar ship could yield enough wealth to pay his entire crew for months. Then, before hurricane season closed the Caribbean, he sailed north along the American coast, sometimes as far as Newfoundland, raiding fishing fleets for food, salt, and ships small enough to use as scouts. Then back across the Atlantic to Africa for the winter. He weaponized cheap labor by recruiting impressed sailors and freed slaves directly off captured decks. He weaponized geography by using 2 oceans as his rotation. He weaponized branding by making the name Royal Fortune appear in 3 places at once. In 3 years of operation, by the most conservative count that historians can verify from colonial records, Bartholomew Roberts captured more than 400 ships. The standard estimate is 470. Some scholars place the number above 500. For comparison, Blackbeard captured roughly 40 vessels in his entire career. Calico Jack Rackham captured fewer than 10. Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, captured perhaps a dozen. Bartholomew Roberts captured more ships than every other famous pirate of the Golden Age combined. He was the most efficient maritime entrepreneur of the 18th century, and the British Empire could not allow him to continue another season. By late 1721, the Lords of the Admiralty had assigned a specific officer to hunt Bartholomew Roberts down. His name was Captain Challoner Ogle of the HMS Swallow, a 50-gun frigate built for blue water combat. Ogle was a methodical, patient officer. He understood that chasing Roberts in open ocean was futile, because Roberts was a better navigator and his ships were faster on the wind. Ogle decided to ambush him instead. The trap took shape in February of 1722, off Cape Lopez on the coast of modern Gabon. Roberts had captured a large Royal African Company slaver called the Onslow and converted her into his latest royal fortune. He was anchored in the bay with 2 other consort ships. His men had taken a French prize the previous day and were celebrating with the wine they had liberated. Most of the crew was either drunk or hung over by the morning of February 10th. Roberts, of course, was sober. The HMS Swallow appeared on the horizon. Ogle had disguised her, painting over her gun ports and trimming her sails to look like a fleeing merchant vessel. Roberts saw the silhouette and, according to the surviving testimony, ordered one of his consorts, the Ranger, to give chase. The Ranger sailed out of the bay and pursued what she thought was easy prey. Once over the horizon and out of sight of the bay, Ogle ran out his guns, revealed his true identity, and battered the Ranger into surrender in a short fight. Then he turned around and came back for the royal fortune. When the Swallow returned to Cape Lopez 2 days later, again disguised, Roberts at first thought she was his own consort returning with a prize. By the time he recognized the deception, the warship was within musket range. Roberts dressed for the occasion. The chronicler Captain Charles Johnson, drawing on the testimony of survivors, describes him standing on the quarterdeck in a rich crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, a red feather in his hat, the diamond cross of the Portuguese king on a gold chain around his neck, 2 pairs of pistols hanging from a silk sling over his shoulders. He looked, by the description of one Royal Navy lieutenant who saw him through a spyglass, like an opera prince going to a ball. He gave the order to slip the cable and try to run past the Swallow on the wind. It was the right tactical decision. The Royal Fortune was a faster ship in close quarters. If he could clear the bay, he could outrun Ogle in open water. He nearly made it. As the Royal Fortune passed within pistol range of the Swallow, the British warship fired a full broadside. 1 ball of grape shot, a cluster of small iron pellets designed to shred sails and men at close range, struck Bartholomew Roberts in the throat. He was killed instantly. He never gave a final speech. He never even fell to the deck dramatically. According to the eyewitness account of the helmsman, he slumped against the rigging with his sword still in his hand, and his blood ran down the front of his crimson coat without staining it much because the coat was already that color. The crew, panicked but loyal to one final article of his code, did exactly what he had standing orders for them to do. They threw his body overboard, fully dressed, with the jeweled cross still around his neck, before the British could capture his corpse and hang it from a gibbet in Cape Coast Castle. Bartholomew Roberts went into the Atlantic in the same finery he had lived in. The sea took him, and the sea has never given him back. To this day, no human being has ever seen the body of the most successful pirate in history. The battle continued for another 2 hours, but the heart of the pirate fleet was gone. The Royal Fortune was captured. The crew surrendered. The aftermath of Roberts's death was the largest pirate trial in human history. Captain Challoner Ogle hauled the surviving members of the crew to Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast, the same slave fort whose harbor had once held the tarred bodies of Roberts's earlier captured men. 264 pirates were taken into custody. Many were Africans who had been forced into service or who had voluntarily joined. Many were impressed sailors who had been kidnapped, as Roberts himself once was, and who had served the pirate fleet against their will. The trial was a public spectacle. Henry Glasby, the man whose life Roberts had once personally saved, testified against the crew at length and was rewarded with a full pardon and eventually given command of a Royal Navy vessel. Other impressed men were acquitted on the strength of their stories. But the verdicts went the way the Empire wanted. 54 pirates were sentenced to death and hanged in batches over the following weeks. Their bodies were tarred and hung in iron cages along the African coast as warnings to other sailors. 37 more were sentenced to long terms of indentured servitude in the gold mines of West Africa, which was a slower death sentence. Most of the African crew members were sold back into slavery. The Royal Fortune herself, the ship that had given her name to a legend, was confiscated by the Royal Navy and eventually broken up for timber. Historians of piracy mark the morning of February 10, 1722, as the precise end of the Golden Age. Other pirates continued to operate for a few more years, but the great age of fleet pirates, of pirate kings who could threaten colonial governments, ended with the death of Bartholomew Roberts. Captain Ogle was knighted for the victory, becoming the only Royal Navy officer in history to be knighted specifically for killing a pirate. He died wealthy and respected in 1750. Walter Kennedy, the man whose betrayal had pushed Roberts into greatness, had already been hanged at Execution Dock in London 2 years before the Cape Lopez battle. He died drunk and forgotten. The man who chose the small life had been erased. The man who chose the dangerous life had been written into every maritime chronicle of the next 3 centuries. When we look back at the Bartholomew Roberts true story, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable reality about ambition and the lives that ambition chooses for us. The most successful pirate in history did not begin as a pirate. He began as a victim, a hardworking Welsh navigator who fought against his kidnappers for 6 weeks before fate handed him a black flag and a crew of murderers. He could have refused. He could have demanded marooning rather than command. He could have accepted a pardon at any point in his 3-year career. Every door out remained open until the morning the grape shot found his throat. He chose, day after day, to keep walking through the one door that led further into the dark. What he built in that darkness was extraordinary. A written constitution centuries before workers in honest professions had any such protections. A disability insurance scheme that would not be matched by legitimate employers for generations. A multinational fleet operating under shared branding. A 2-ocean supply chain. 400 captured ships. A reputation so total that entire towns fled at the sight of his sails. And yet, when the end came, he had nowhere left to run. The Atlantic that had made him into a legend pulled him under in his crimson coat with his diamond cross still around his neck, and gave him no grave that any of us can visit. He outran every empire on earth. He could not outrun the sea that made him. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the brutal true story of Bartholomew Roberts and the Royal Fortune, please hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Was Black Bart a free man who built something extraordinary in a corrupt age, or just a better organized slave to his own ambition? Let me know what you think. I look forward to exploring more hidden corners of history with you next time.